Thank you. Obligatory mic check. Everything's good. Great. Thanks. Yeah, this is a wonderful setup, and maybe a wonderful sort of two sides of this kind of coin conversation that we can start hopefully at the end of this, because we're going to go from a very methodical, detailed approach to looking at what is the right thing to measure, what is the right thing to do, to what I'll, for lack of a better word, call maybe a bit more of a scrappy approach to saying, like, how do we then translate this into something that gets used directly in the planning process. So I'm going to talk a bit about a project that sort of has been iterative, is built on a number of works and creations, not necessarily publications, but things that have been done. Specifically looking at the equity of transport futures, so looking at forecasts and planning. But a lot of the thing I'm going to talk about in the tools I'm going to introduce, they don't necessarily need to be about the future. They can also be about the present or even the past. And this builds on work done initially by Drs. Stephen Farber and Jeff Allen, and collaboration with Metrolinx. And then there was, through sort of an iterative collaboration process with Metrolinx, we've turned this into a much more open source and broader tool that I'll talk about a little bit later. So I'm only going to very briefly provide just, everybody, I think at this symposium, you've probably heard these motivations plenty of times, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but transportation equities focusing on fairness. And specifically, when we're talking about transportation projects, we're interested in the distribution of costs and benefits of the transportation system. So costs and benefits brings to mind, business cases, things like that. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But of course, it opens up a lot of questions that I'm hoping that Anastasia and Ignacio and everybody are able to shed some more holistic light on when they finish their review, which is, what exactly are the costs? What is fair? How do we measure that kind of thing? And I like to start a little bit philosophical, and so drawing on two sort of giants in the transportation equity research area. There's sort of two potential philosophies about transportation equity: this idea of sufficientarianism, lots of long words that are hard to say, that are looking at like a minimum standard of transport supply, and we should be providing sort of a minimum standard. And then Karen Lucas, who looks at the idea of removing barriers and looking at gaps among transport poor. And when we refer to transport poverty, I really enjoy this diagram because I think it sort of outlines the complexity of the whole conversation, even from a quantitative aspect. And this sort of intersection of transport disadvantage and social disadvantage can create this concept of transport poverty, which sort of creates this cycle of inaccessibility to opportunities and activity participation, and then social exclusion, which sort of cycles around. And swirling around this, there's, politics and social norms, but particularly for this conversation, there's governments and their decision-making frameworks. And so part of the conversation today is talking about, how can we help influence those decision-making frameworks, or at least provide tools for people to make more informed decisions or more nuanced decisions within those decision-making frameworks. And that diagram reminds me of something that I've started including when I talk about transit planning in general, or teach transit planning and data analysis, which is this concept of a wicked problem, which sort of transportation and transit in particular falls under this category, in that, everything is tied to each other. There's not an obvious right or wrong solution. Problems are unique. They're never completely solved. And there's a lot of stakeholders. And so it becomes this, I think, as James mentioned or sort of articulated really well, that we talk about things in a broad sense. And maybe we sometimes lose track of implementing things directly. It also reminded me of something I've just recently come across, which is this model of the ladder of inference, which is sort of the way that we sort of as human nature make inferences and adjustments to our beliefs and the actions we do based on those beliefs, based on our sort of filtered view of reality. And just partly by the nature of transportation being such a wicked problem, you really can't get the whole picture at once in a detailed sense. And so we get a filtered understanding, and the way that some of this analysis and visualization and things can help is to to help inject nuance and change a little bit the meaning and interpretation of the things we're seeing, which can then sort of inject into the cycle as well. Just as a summary, in the Canadian context, there's definitely a growing amount of transport poverty. There's unaffordability in housing and transportation. There's growing inequality, as we see from this plot of a Gini coefficient index. And that poverty is suburbanizing, which obviously has transportation and specifically public transit implications. And there's really insufficient public transit in places where people are maybe dependent on it. And that can be illustrated again here in Toronto by a wonderful map by Jeff Allen and Steve Farber, which sort of shows the quality of transit, or the transit accessibility, at least as a score or as a measure of what transit can convey, overlaid with people living below the poverty line. And you can see sort of immediately geographically that things don't necessarily mesh up, and that creates gaps between the opportunities people can access. So there's lots of Canadians that are at risk of this kind of transport-related social exclusion, and adding transit accessibility or improving transit accessibility can help eliminate some of the differences in activity participation in this social exclusion, specifically, especially with zero-car households. So that sort of sets the stage for sort of the need to have specifically governments and transit agencies to start acting on this and understanding where these are, and then moving towards implementing decisions and changes. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we might go from specifically transportation models, which is something that's sort of baked into the transportation planning process at the moment, to business cases, and how we can take some of those outputs and look at how those outputs and those benefits or costs are distributed among various population groups, and in a way of supporting a business case. So if you're not familiar with sort of the structure of a business case, the idea is the hopeful idea is to have sort of a comprehensive collection of information that can help inform whether an investment should be made at all, why an investment should be implemented, does it solve a problem, does it address an opportunity. And common things we see in business cases are, of course, economic, financial, and deliverability, costs and benefits. Those things tend to be easier to quantify, or at least more standardized to quantify, in terms of how much it costs to build and some of the economic impact. But I do feel that the strategic case, it's often harder to evaluate quantitatively. While I think it is maybe one of the most important things in terms of actually providing a vision for the future and providing a strategic direction, it can often get maybe diminished a little bit by having more difficulty in doing some of the quantitative aspects of it. So these technical analysis that go into these business cases, there's really currently not a lot, if any, equity impacts measured in these. So we don't really talk about who and by how much people will be impacted. We specifically don't talk about who very much. And we don't know if those sort of distribution of benefits are expanding a gap, going back to Karen Lucas, or whether they're, whether they're progressive, whether they're shrinking a gap, or whether it's a rising tide lifts all boats situation. And we don't talk much about whether the project meets the needs of marginalized communities. And then sort of as a last thing, obviously transportation and land use are very strongly linked. There's a cycle, it's not a one-way street. And so there was a little bit of wanting to know if we can at least explore a little bit whether when projects induce land use change, and how does that impact communities, and who does that impact. Business cases typically use travel demand models, for better or for worse, to make a lot of their quantitative decisions. So the four-step transportation model, I don't need to necessarily go through the four-step transportation model, but it's a series of econometric models which make some assumptions and some understanding about how people are changing their behavior when new transportation options or new transportation systems are introduced. But ultimately, what you get out of it is what we're interested in working with. So you get origin destination travel times. So you have a travel time matrix showing origin destination travel times, perhaps for different configurations of a travel plan or different sort of imagined futures. You also get flow matrices. So you get an estimation of how many people are going to travel between two given origin destination areas or points in a region that's being modeled. And then you sometimes get some information about who's using what mode and some of the trip purposes that are behind. And you know, a model is of course never right. So there's always some simplifications about the trip purposes, and we're not going to get into that, but that's certainly something to keep in mind as we go through some of this. So there are quantitative numbers in strategic cases, strategic business cases. So there's a recent example of the Yonge North Subway Extension initial business case, and you can see there are quantitative analyses of people getting increased accessibility, you know, how much extra accessibility is being provided to how many people, how much travel time savings are happening, who's living near these systems, or specific. But if you search the business case for words like justice or equity, they don't really show up at all. And so we can see sort of this idea that there's obviously technical capability to do accessibility analysis and look at travel time savings, but the distributive impacts of those are not currently being included in any of the published business cases so far. So what we've produced is a tool, and I'll get in a little bit into the details of that, to take some of these model outputs and create equity metrics. So back to this conversation about standardization, this is sort of a first blush, a presentation of something you can do. Certainly the idea is this is a very open process and people can change things, they can adapt them to their context, but this is sort of a workflow that we're proposing that people can follow along and help hopefully lower some of the barriers to doing this in other places. And so at the top of this sort of complex diagram, all of the dot or the dashed line boxes are all sort of various data inputs. So, you know, where the transit project is accessed, station locations, routable networks. So we used OpenStreetMap often to talk about routable networks. You need some information from the model, traffic analysis zones, typically some information about who lives where that comes from the census in the form of dissemination area census profiles. There's information that can come from travel surveys if those are available, so like the TTS, if you need attributes from individuals that don't fall into the census, as well as obviously opportunity locations are needed to do accessibility analysis, and then the two matrices that I discussed. And the idea is to sort of work through this process. The blue boxes are typically spatial analysis. So in the workbooks and in the process, you can use an open source software like QGIS to do the spatial analysis part. And then it goes into a sort of calculation tabular part to calculate the final scores and the final quantitative values. And at the end, we get what I'm sort of calling 4+1 different things that you can measure or analyze. And I'll walk through them each individually, but very briefly, that we're looking at two that are to look at sort of the change in possibility or potential, which is access to opportunities, and to a lesser extent, who lives nearby stations. So how equitable is it to even access transit, like access the infrastructure in the first place? And then we're looking at potential change in outcomes in terms of how is behavior changing, or how are travel times and the potential sort of utility improvement or quality of life improvement. And I'll talk a little bit about that you might see. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about how to maybe model some population dynamics in a broad sense to learn a little bit about how sensitive the region is to change mostly, and how that might be expanded. So as sort of an open source part of this, we are using some older data from analysis done on a smart track plan from several years ago. It was courteously provided to us by the Mobility Network, by Eric Miller. And we are sort of using this as a, shall we say, a test case or a dummy case, or a case you can sort of use to learn about the thing. But the actual results of this are sort of illustrative rather than the actual point of the of the work. But Smart Track was a sort of, I guess, S-Bahn style transit proposal to run frequent rail service in this sort of U-shaped corridor, and fill in a number of stations, so lower the station spacing to try and increase access. That was proposed as part, I think, as part of Mayor Tory's campaign the first time, and it's gone through a number of different things. And there's no transit project proposal in Toronto that isn't political, so I'll leave it at that. We looked at 3 different scenarios. So with models, you're often comparing different scenarios. So we looked at sort of the premium one, which is 5-minute headways. So trains come very often. You're using a standard TTC fare. The other one is to look at a much larger headway. So 15-minute headways, trains come every 15 minutes, but they're still on that base fare. And finally, a sort of premium fare where we use the Go fare distance-based system to learn about. We use the Go fare system to model the fares, and so it's more expensive to travel from a given point A to point B as well on that 15-minute headways. So the first thing that you can do, and the sort of first step of this, is that equity of station access. Who lives nearby the stations? And so we can effectively draw sort of a walk shed around each station, and we can look at the census data, automatically join in some of the census data, and learn about who lives nearby each station, and get a sense of how the line sort of traverses through the city, how much various parts of the line might be serving marginalized groups. So here's an example of a visualization you can produce with that, a fairly simple visualization, which is just a line running from west to east. The height of these little lollipops is the percentage of low-income people living near that station. So people below the low-income cutoff. And then the color, or the shade, or the darkness of the lines is the percentage of the population that is visible minority. This comes from the 2016 census. And so you can sort of see a little bit how the line goes through various neighborhoods, how these two variables might correlate a little bit or not correlate, where there are some outliers. And so you can already get a good sense of the lay of the land. And just as an example, you can sort of take this a little bit further if you want, and put together, I'm a big fan of trying to put together some like placemat style, quick look policy documents that decision makers who probably read way too many documents can use to make, to sort of absorb information a lot faster. So this is sort of the same process I used, but I did it for Calgary's LRT lines. So there's the two blue and red ones are existing, and the green one is planned. And so you can learn a little bit about who lives nearby the actual and the hypothetical or future lines, and get some quick understanding of also how the process works. So the next thing you can look at when you have a travel time matrix and a travel demand matrix is weighted travel time savings. So how much does each scenario provide travel time savings? So this is very similar to what we saw tabulated in the Young North Subway Extension thing, which is just looking at where spatially the travel times have changed. So you can see there is some improved savings near some parts of the station, although it's not completely across all station locations. And you can see that those are different. So scenario A on the left is compared to the baseline of doing nothing, and scenario B is compared to the baseline of doing nothing as well. And so you can see some spatial differences. And then, of course, as we saw with Jeff Allen's map, when you intersect that with populations, you can get a sort of population weighted summary of these various population groups and how the projects or the various scenarios compare across things. So we can see here that there's certainly a stark difference in the overall travel time savings conveyed, and those are sort of distributed across these sort of sample groups. Again, I'm not getting into the standards of which groups we should pick or not pick, but just to give an illustrative example of these three: low income measure, unemployed, and visible minority. And you may be able to see that the distribution of these may not be exactly even. And so you can kind of take this a step further and look at maybe some ratios or see how much the gaps between these different groups might be changing. You can do a similar thing with what we sort of call utility gains. So back to the concept of the transportation demand model, roughly speaking, when if you sort of see an increase of a specific type of mode, people switch, say, from car to transit. They do that on average because there's a slightly higher utility that they experience in the model for transit than they did for car than before. So in theory, on average, if people are switching, there's always randomness in there, but on average, when people are switching, there's an increased utility to those people. And so they're getting some kind of benefit as we are quantifying it in the model. And so we can use that increased demand as a proxy for this utility gain. So how many people are making this mode switch or making these changes, and do the same thing, these population weighted distributions. And you can see, you do get a little bit of a different comparative distribution among the different groups, as well as the 3 projects. So the differences aren't necessarily as stark between the projects, but they're stronger between the groups, I find. Of course, access to opportunities is an incredibly important measure. I don't think I need to explain what it is, but we looked at, you can look at any opportunity sort of data set that you have. Often models will look at education and like number of university seats or number of primary school seats and jobs as sort of a baseline. So we started with that. So this is access to employment changes. Again, this is just a map showing increases and decreases in access to employment from that sort of highest quality scenario compared to the baseline. And so you can see that spatially, most of those benefits are a little bit more towards the east, or definitely towards the outskirts of the city. And again, you can calculate a sort of population weighted summary of how the change in access has been conveyed between these different scenarios compared to the business as usual scenario. And you get a distribution as well. And so these are sort of just graphs and tables that you could put into, in theory, into a business case to add some nuance about different population groups. Finally, we looked at, there was a little bit of work looking at population dynamics. And so we considered sort of 3 very simple scenarios. We were looking at sort of a gentrification scenario where people were effectively moving from areas of low transit access. We had high income people moving from areas of low transit access to areas that had increased or higher transit access. And we had low income people moving from areas of high transit access to areas of low transit access. And so we effectively swapped 2,000 people every iteration. So you sort of assume 2,000 people throughout the city move in that way. So we randomly picked where they were, we swapped them, and we ran this through a number of iterations. And then the, for lack of a better word, degentrification process is the opposite. So areas with high access attracted low income individuals, perhaps through a policy of building low income housing near transit, things like that. And higher income people were then swapped out. And then you can sort of see how the ratio, so what we're looking here on the y-axis is the ratio of low income households to the ratio of non-low income households. So basically the complement of non-low income households. So a ratio of 1 means it's equal in terms of the access to opportunities. A ratio higher than 1 means it is a slightly higher access for low income individuals. And so you can see with the gentrification situation, there's a decrease and that number drops fairly quickly below that unit value, that equal value, for lack of a better word. We looked also at polarization, which was simply that throughout the city, richer areas got richer and poorer areas got poorer. So we didn't talk about accessibility. People weren't making strategic transport moves. They were just richer areas got richer, poorer areas got poorer. And we found that throughout the city there, you can see there's not quite as much of a sensitive change to that. So very sort of simple initial idea of trying to include some ideas of land use change into the conversation. And all of this has been bundled together into the idea was to sort of lower the barrier to actually producing these kinds of charts. We know that the data is out there, that people are generating these travel time matrices for other analysis. So why not make it very easy to take that information and produce some people and group sensitive charts so that can sort of be added into the conversation. There's currently a GitHub. It might move at some point to an MJ GitHub, which you can download, you can contribute to if you wanted to, you can work with, and it contains all of the sample data for the smart track scenario if you want to run your own analysis, if you want to look at the assumptions that were made, if you want to look at changing some of the way things are done. But it's a way for people to just get started. And if your data is formatted in the exact same way or very similarly to the way it's formatted in SmartTrack, you can actually pretty much just plug and play and put your own data into that as well. So it comes with a series of Python notebooks, very kind of written out Python notebooks with a narration of what's going on. And then there's an accompanying handbook, which also provides sort of a context of what we're doing in a given step and how to go about doing that kind of thing. So they work well off of each other. So there's some limitations. These are just 3 of them, but I'm sure you've identified some of the limitations. There's lots of limitations that come from using a travel demand model. The one of which is that it looks only at peak travel, usually peak period travel. So it has a hard time modeling irregular commuting patterns. There's bias in how well a model can handle linked trips and trips that are more complex, and the trips that are more complex can often be done by historically marginalized groups. It uses the same land use and population forecast, so there's not a very sophisticated, unless you're using a model that does this, there's not a sophisticated land use forecast that is adaptive really to the transportation input or the change in the system. And we definitely have a limited understanding of how these major transit projects induce change in a given area. And so there's certainly a limitation there. And then kind of going back all the way back around to this standard, part of the sort of motivation or the hope is that this can be used as a starting point for people to create these metrics, create these results, and then be able to look and compare projects and talk about projects. And obviously there's lots of comparison within a transit agency about the benefits or costs of different projects or different options. But those conversations don't include conversations about equity. And so there's sort of, this is an initial blush at trying to develop, a consistent reporting approach that can be used. Hopefully the work that Anastasia and company are doing will be able to inform that as well. Further to that, it's not exactly clear sort of to what extent these charts or these results would affect decision making in the first place. And so I think the first step is to have them so people can react to them and see them. And then it becomes a question of, to what extent does or should that part influence the overall business case as well. Quick shout out, everything on this code is open source. And so thank you to everybody who's ever developed for any of these places, because it certainly lowers the barrier. There's no cost to doing this kind of thing. You just need a computer, and all of these open source softwares are helping contribute to that kind of thing. And as a final plug, I'm very excited because this is just something that just came out recently. We've published a Python wrapper for a routing engine called R5, which is an extremely fast engine for calculating travel time matrices using transit or walking or driving in a given region. It's very fast and it's great, and it's published by Conveil, but it's not super easy to interact with, and it's in Java. And so there is an R version of this, which lets you interact with it using R. And if you're a Python user like me, who's avoided R so far, you can now run and create travel time matrices extremely fast using R5R. So feel free to take a look at that while we're talking about it. So that's it. I'm happy to answer any questions. Feel free to star the GitHub if you want. If you're that kind of person. I would say if you have specific questions, technical questions or curiosities or things you want to ask about the code in general, feel free to open an issue on the GitHub as well. That's another good way to interact with this kind of stuff. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Willem. And I see that James Pertula has a hand up. So, James.
Thanks, Willem. You touched on a lot of things that are really, I think, relevant to some of the work that we're doing in transportation planning at the City of Toronto, or regularly have to deal with. And in particular, I'm interested in the thinking you've been doing around business case measures and how it reflects. I think you're right that the strategic case is probably the place that some of this fits the best. One of the challenges that we've had is that so much of the business case also often gets boiled down to one number, which is the cost benefit ratio. And so the challenge of being able to monetize things is a real issue. We've done a lot to try and monetize climate change benefits. How do you put a dollar value on reduced greenhouse gas emissions? There may be ways that you could put a dollar value on some of the things that that you're measuring, but I think that's another thing we're going to have to grapple with. And I sometimes feel like sometimes it drives me crazy that everything comes down to a monetary value, because I think the strategic case sometimes needs to explain other things that are important, and you can't always put a value, an explicit value on it, but it's the reality of how those business cases work. I don't know whether in the work that you were doing on some of these measures, you started to get into that or thought about how that might work.
The short answer is no. We haven't sort of gotten into the business of trying to translate the sort of a reduction in gap, say, to a dollar value. There is some parallel work that's looking at that a little bit, and I think possibly, I don't know if Steve wants to say anything about that or has any thoughts about that, because he would be the most in touch.
Yeah,
with that.
two quick thoughts. One is that the most readily monetized value, for accessibility is probably something related to utility gains that come out of the travel demand model, because theoretically there are kind of some straightforward ways to convert utility into dollar values through kind of the coefficients in the models inside the travel demand model. But then again, we have to, I'm still dubious that the type of utility or the ways that those models measure utility still ignore a lot of benefits of transit that are really important from an equity perspective. So some of my work on whether or not transportation investments are unlocking suppressed demand for travel. So when we build new transit, does it mean that people are participating in more daily activities as a result, especially equity seeking or equity, deserving groups? That could have a major economic benefit associated with it. And I think a lot more work is still needed to understand the monetization of unlocking demand and providing people more opportunity to go out and participate in their daily life activities.
And I would maybe add to that maybe I'll just be a bit more strong there, which is that I think the fundamental flaw of something like a business case cost ratio is that the benefits tend to be much harder to quantify than the costs. And so you're going in, you're using a single metric to make a decision, which is already hugely problematic. And then you're using a flawed metric. And so my pushback is maybe that doesn't have to be the reality of how decision-making process works. And maybe we can be more nuanced. And, the business cost ratio is one metric. And there are many others that you can present to a decision maker for them to make a more informed decision. So I sidestep that a little bit to say that maybe there's another way forward there.
No, I would agree with you. I'm more reflecting part of the reality, but I agree with you that there's more that needs to be done. I do have another question, but I notice someone else has his hand up, so I'm gonna.
Milos, I see, has his hand up.
Milos?
Hi, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
I guess you do. Greetings from Finland. It's not dark yet, but maybe it will be soon. Who knows? I joined the conference. I saw the title "Mobilizing Justice." I was curious to learn what's happening on your side of the world. So I'm not sure if I have an easy question, because we're trying to develop a carbon negative urban plan in the city of Helsinki. Not a carbon zero, not a low carbon, but a carbon negative plan. And it feels very alone, to be honest. In that effort, we have tried to find examples around the world. They're like largely missing, it seems so. And why? Because it's a question of justice, of course, yeah. Because we have to ask this question: how much are we willing to sacrifice some comfort that we have here in this welfare state in the north of Europe, for the sake of the rest of the humanity on this planet, and maybe for the rest of life on this planet. So if anyone has any hope to give me regarding this, how do we calculate that? How do we model? Where do we start? Any practical solutions? If you don't, maybe some reflection on what should we doing one way or another. But yeah, that was sort of, I hope you understand this question of not just transport justice or mobility justice, but sort of existential justice. Yeah.
That is,
yeah, anyone can take that.
Thank you, Milos. That's a big, really interesting question. I don't know if Willem, you would like to add something to that, or Steve, maybe. Negative carbon, the negative carbon city.
Yeah, well, I mean, just to circle back, the R5 Pi development is coming from Finland as well, mostly being driven by Finland. So the Finns are definitely leading the way on a lot of that kind of stuff. Most of that does sound like a conversation that's good to have over a beer of some kind, but certainly, from a hope point of view, I think that we can see it. Someone once talked to me about trying to turn the Titanic with a canoe paddle, but when you're turning the Titanic with a canoe paddle, you're still turning the Titanic, and so I hope that's the only way to do this moving forward, is to chip away at these kinds of things. So I won't talk about carbon. I'm not a carbon expert at all, and but Steve, I don't know if you have more thoughts.
Well, I'll just say that we certainly are very aware that the equity conversations around transportation planning happen within groups that can become a bit insular, and that don't stop to seriously overlay equity goals along with climate goals when it comes to transportation planning. And I think that we spend a lot of time problematizing, choosing between different types of equity interventions in the transportation space, where a lot of the time, kind of, if we also added in a climate lens on top of that, we would be able to eliminate a lot of those options that we're considering on the equity front, say like promoting more car ownership or car use as an equity tool. It looks really great within the independent and isolated lens of just equity, right? But it immediately becomes problematic when we overlay the climate lens. So I just would take what you're saying and say to the research community and the practitioner community that much more is needed on this front in terms of seriously taking those two domains together and starting to create some matrices around what kind of interventions make sense from both perspectives. And a big question there that we don't always look about is the time horizon that we're planning for as well, and the time horizon that we're trying to intervene on the equity front. Helping people out today on the short term might be in automobility, but on the short term, we've got a climate crisis already here, right? So very, very like fertile grounds for further reflection and research and discussion.
So, I mean, Anastasia put a comment in the chat, but I think that probably starting point, because any form of transportation is going to be a positive source of carbon, even if it's cycling. I mean, people are exhaling CO2. So any form of transportation, even the ones that we will say it's negligible, will produce carbon, right? So I think that this has to have two components. One component is what are your carbon sinks, right? So then you can say, we can absorb this much carbon, and then compare that against what is being produced by the transportation system, right? Including, and in addition to everything else that produces carbon in the region that you're interested in. So you begin with the sinks. How much is your absorption capacity? And then how much of that is allocated to transportation activities? And then within that, then what you can do is this, the sort of equity analysis that we are sort of investigating. How can you plan for transportation in such a way that, the cost of reducing carbon does not fall disproportionately on some populations, right? I think that there are some of these other factors. I mean, in the United States, some of our colleagues advocate for auto ownership as an equity measure, but in a very narrow sense, that is access to employment, right? And again, we are at a point where we have to be a lot more holistic about that. It's not just in the short term. Getting jobs is the most urgent thing, because we cannot put punt on what are some of those other impacts. So in the shorter term, for access to jobs, cars may be great. In the longer term, we're all going to die because of climate change, right? So I think that it's a really complex, interesting question. But in the broadest sense, I think it's what are your sinks? How can you improve your absorption capacity? And then how much of that is transportation? How do you plan for transportation in a way that that's not inequitable? Hopefully.
Can I reply still?
Yes, of course.
I mean, I understand what you're saying, but still in practice, we have the number. We know that number one thing is car mileage.
Mm-hmm.
That the whole planet needs to reduce, and I don't see us correcting past injustices that exist obviously in the North American societies by creating further injustices globally. So I think we have to talk also about, especially the North American academia has to talk about these root injustices in your societies, and try to also not forget that then you might just as well create global injustices by trying to fix those in a short-term manner. So
yeah, thank you, Milos.
Otherwise, we will swim over there, yeah,
yes.
and then ask for our share one day.
Right. So
there is. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. Lots of food for thought, I think. And Anastasia, I hope you're taking notes, because it connects also with your interest in emissions. So it's time to finish the session. So thank you to Anastasia